Magnus Carlsen is a great Norwegian chess player who became the youngest Grand Master when he gained the title at the age of 13. Magnus was a world chess champion in 2013, 2014, 2016, and then in 2018 as well, where he came out with exemplary skills and talent to perform under pressure. Carlsen remained at the top in the FIDE World Rankings for a long period of about 10 years, which is a great achievement, and became an unparalleled opponent in chess. But who would have expected that even great players get bad karma sometimes? Now, Carlsen was against Morozevich in the game when Morozevich was ranked number 2 during his peak period. The game started when Carlsen moved his pawn to c4, and in response, Alexander moved his pawn to e6. The game started and was normally played by both the players, and the game looked like an English opening, which was that the white pawns were at c3 and g4, and the black pawns were at d5 and f6. Alexander takes the white c4 pawn, and in response, Magnus moves his bishop to g2. In this situation, Magnus has castled, but the pieces of Alexander are not developed yet, and he has an extra pawn and moves his pawn to b5 to defend his other pawn c4, which was very weak. After some thought by Magnus, he moves his pawn to a4 to attack the middle pawn of Alexander. Now, Alexander moves his bishop to the diagonal, which traded off some pawns, and Magnus also places his bishop to the diagonal. Now Alexander has an advantage, and Magnus was not happy with his position. But later, Magnus started creating an attack on the black king by giving away his rook for a knight, and he made a triple attack on the pawns of Alexander on f7, which he defended by using his queen. After some thinking, Magnus is planning an extremely dangerous attack, and moves his knight g4, to which Alexander must defend himself, so he moves his bishop. Magnus moves knight f6, and he wanted to use his queen to invade Alexander's position, but it was too late. Alexander has too many extra pieces, and he forces another trade with bishop d5, causing Magnus's bishop to his king, and after a long game, Alexander secures his king in a corner and threatens checkmate by taking the pawn on h4, therefore leaving Magnus with only one option, which was to resign from the game. Boris Savchenko is a Russian chess player who has won some championships and has competed in a few tournaments throughout his life. In this game, Magnus moves his pawn to e4, and in response, Boris moves to c5, and after a set of moves by both parties, the game turns into a Sicilia defense where white pawns are on c4 and e4, and the black pawns are on c6 and f6. Magnus moves his bishop to e2, and now both the players were at equal positions. And now Magnus tried to create an advantage for himself when Boris develops his bishop. Magnus moves his bishop to e3 to create a difficulty for Boris. Here, his plan was to attack after moving his pawn to f4. But this did not seem to affect Boris, as he moved his queen to a5, where his rooks are at the back grouped together, to which Magnus responds by moving his rook to the side, and after thinking quickly, Boris played actively by moving his rook. Magnus starts to attack the pawn, which makes Boris retreat his knight to a safe place, and at this point, Magnus makes a blunder and moves his knight to d5. This move made by Magnus gives away a pawn to Boris, which he took using his queen, and in response, Magnus pushes his pawn. But after some moves, Boris moves his knight f6, which was a blunder at his end, and Magnus moves his knight to c3, and then he can move his pawn to b5 at his turn again to win a knight. Boris knew he messed up, so he gave away his knight, and after some moves, the bishops are traded off, and Magnus offers a trade between the queens. This trade is not good for Boris because it is difficult to play the endgame against Magnus, but he had no other option, so he accepted the queen trade and moved his bishop to b6. Boris moved his pawn to f5 in response, to which Magnus uses his king to come closer, after which a set of pawns were traded, and Magnus moves his pawn to h3, and Boris brings his king closer. Magnus moves his rook up, and then Boris moves his rook to b3, and now both players have an equal position, and Boris declines a trade offered by Magnus and attacked the knight, and Magnus moves back his bishop, which Boris attacked. The time was little, and pressure started to build up in the atmosphere, and Boris attacks the bishop, and Magnus checks the king of Boris, forcing a trade-off of rook, and after some moves, Boris moves his pawn to c3, where Magnus blocks his queen, and then Boris defends his pawn using the bishop, giving Magnus a little better position than Boris, and a chance to win if he plays carefully. Both parties played some moves, and then Magnus takes the pawn, and then the bishop and rook were traded, leaving Magnus with a rook and 2 pawns, and Boris with bishop and 4 pawns. It was expected to be a draw if no blunder is made, and they moved their pieces in round till Magnus plays his king to d3, which he thought would defend his pawns from the king of Boris. But it was a blunder. Boris moves his bishop back to e1, and Magnus moves his king to d4. This allowed Boris to check the king, after which Boris can win a free rook as well as after any move by Magnus, but Magnus instantly moved his king to a better place just after he had played his move, which was an illegal move which Boris pointed out. Thus, as it was an illegal move, the next match was even more tiring. If you are liking the video so far, make sure to subscribe to the channel. In this game, Magnus opens with the move d4, and Alexis responds with d5. We have a queen's gambit declined. Magnus captures the pawn on d5 with cx d5, and Alexis recaptures with ex d5. Now, instead of the more common moves like bishop g5 or knight f3, Alexis surprises Magnus with bishop f4. This move makes Magnus pause, as it's not the main move in this position. Magnus takes his time to think and responds with c6, followed by e3 and bishop f5. Alexis plays f3, and Magnus considers the sharp move knight h5, which leads to complex positions. However, Magnus decides against it and plays c6 instead. Now, Magnus is already consuming a significant amount of time, and Alexis is well prepared. Magnus develops his knight to a6 with knight a6, and after Alexis brings his knight back to c3 with knight e2, it's clear that white has a fluid center and a potential for a strong e4 break. Magnus, aware of the need to neutralize white's central control, decides to castle kingside. However, the position is already challenging for black due to white's strong pawn structure on e4 and d4. Magnus plays queen b6, putting pressure on the d4 and b2 pawns. Alexis responds with e5, and after Magnus takes the knight on d5 with knight takes d5, white captures the pawn on e5 with pawn takes e5. At this point, Alexis willingly sacrifices his bishop on f4, knowing that Magnus capturing it would allow him to take it back with the rook. Alexis plays h3, consolidating his position and exerting control over the g4 square. Magnus decides to castle kingside, but he's already in a difficult situation with white's pawns on e4 and d4 dominating the board. With the pressure mounting, Magnus takes on b2 with his queen, aiming to trade queens and relieve some pressure. Alexis, aware of the winning opportunity, accepts the queen trade with pawn takes a3. Magnus tries to defend his position, but his bishop on e7 is under attack, and there's also pressure on the f7 square. The position quickly deteriorates for Magnus after he takes on e2, as white suddenly gains a decisive advantage. To defend his bishop and avoid losing material, Magnus plays bishop a7, but it's clear that the position is lost. Recognizing the inevitable, Magnus smiles, resigns, and congratulates Alexis on his victory. What do you think of these moments? Let us know in the comment section below, and make sure to like the video. Thanks for watching.